In this video, we're going to implement the response object model. The response object model is responsible for the return of the JSON response to the end user or client. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is to create an htaccess file. And this is a bit of a configuration file for Apache. What I'm going to use this for is to display any errors on the screen. Now in a production environment you wouldn't do this, but just for our development purposes we are going to enable the display of errors, just in case we make any along the way. It makes it easy to troubleshoot. So first things first, we'll open up Atom. And what we need to do is add our project folder to Atom, because at the minute it is just a blank editor. Now the project folder is the folder structure that we created in the previous lesson. So to do that, go to File, Add Project Folder, go to the Applications folder, into MAMP, htdocs, and version 1. We're going to stay here in the root of version 1. So make sure you click version 1 and click Open. So you can see on the left hand side we've got version 1, and then we've got our controller and model folders. Ignore these dsstore folders, they're hidden files for the Mac operating system. These won't have any bearing on what we're doing. So in the root of the version 1 folder we need to create a new file called htaccess, and this is an Apache configuration file. So if we right click on v1, new file, it asks for a name, and this is important, it is .htaccess. It's important that you have the dot. Press enter. So you can see now we've got the htaccess file on the left hand side. So the first thing we need to do is to add in some configuration. Now for this, all we need to do is type php_flag, and it is display errors on. So what we're going to do here is tell Apache to, if there is a PHP error, just to show it on the screen. Like I say, you wouldn't do this in a production environment, but for our development it is very handy in case we make a typo or some sort of mistake. So if we save that, so Control and S or Command S if you're on a Mac, and we'll just close that down because that's all we're going to use this file for at the moment. Okay, now we'll move on to actually create the response object file. So in the model, we need to create a new model. It's a response model. It's going to be responsible for returning the standard consistent JSON response to the client. Right click on model, go to new file. We'll call this response.php. Else if I can spell it correctly. Response.php. We'll press enter. So we've got a blank PHP file. So what we need to do is create the initial tag, and because we're not having any HTML or anything in here, you don't have to add the end PHP tag. You can if you want, but we're not going to. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create the class. The class is called response. Just create some space here. Okay, as part of the response we have some data or items that we want to return to the user. So what we're going to do is create some private variables to store this data until we're ready to send the response back. So if you can remember from our demo, the response returns items such as success flag, whether that's true or false, HTTP status code, for example a 404 or a 200, any messages such as you forgot to enter a mandatory field, the data, which is the things like the list of tasks or the user details. So what we're going to do is create these variables now. So the first one we need to do is the success variable. So private success. And the next one is the status code. So private. And we'll call this HTTP status code. The next thing we're going to do is messages. This is an array because you can have more than one message held. So we'll initialize this array just to be empty. Private, and we'll call this messages. And like I say, we'll initialize it to be a blank empty array. The next thing we're going to do is the data variable, and this will store the data that we're returning. So private data. And the next two variables we're going to implement are used for in our internal processes within this. So the first one we're going to do is private to cache, and we'll set this initially to false. So the cache variable, what we're going to do, we can cache the response to a request. So for example, if a client requests to return all of their tasks, we can cache that response. So if then the client refreshes or requests their list of tasks within, say, 20 seconds or 30 seconds, we don't have to go back to the server, call the database and return the details from there. We can just cache that response and return the cached response from the client. So that saves any sort of additional load on the server or anything like that. You don't want to cache every response, so that's why we initially set this to false. And what we'll do is, as we generate the response, if we need to cache it, we will explicitly say to cache it. The things that you wouldn't want to cache are credentials, access tokens, anything like that. You definitely don't want to do that. It's a security risk and you don't want to do that. So like I say, we'll set this initially to false, and where we see appropriate, we will enable the cache for that response. Okay, the last variable we're going to implement is something called response data. So private response data, and this is an empty array. Now what we'll do is, after we've built all this up, we create an array which has the structure, and then PHP has a function called JSON encode which converts an array to a JSON response. So it just makes it easier to return a nice sort of response in JSON format. And you'll see that as we obviously build it up. So now we're going to create some functions. If you know anything about object-oriented programming, you'll know that it's good practice to create public getters and setters rather than manipulating the variables directly in the object. So what we're going to do, we're going to run through a set of setters to enable us to set these variables or set values to these variables. So we'll just start at the top. We'll create the set success. So these are public functions, and we'll call this set success. And what we'll do here, we will pass in a success value. Okay, so what we need to do is copy this value from here and put it into the object variable. Just an explanation of what these underscores are. This is just my code and practice. Anything that is instance variables to this object, not any other variable within a method or a function, I always put underscores. It just allows me, when I'm reading the code, to see actually which variable I am talking about, whether it's a local one to the function or whether it's a class or an object variable that I'm talking about. Just makes it easier to read and understand. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is this and success, and we'll want to set this to success. So you can see here, all we're doing is setting this, so this object, success. Sometimes it's important to note that you don't have a $sign here. Don't put the dollar symbol there. It's an easy mistake to make because actually when you define the variables you do, but when you're using them you don't. So if you do get an error in your code, just double check that you haven't got a $sign when you're using this. So what we're doing, we're assigning this success that we'll pass into this function to the instance variable. So that's that. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is the HTTP status code. So we'll just do exactly the same. Public function set HTTP status code. And exactly the same, we'll pass in an HTTP status code. And exactly the same, this, and then underscore HTTP status code equals the passed in one. HTTP status code. Okay, so that's them two done. So the messages array is slightly different, and we'll create that one now. So public function, and we'll call this add message, because don't forget it is an array, so we're not setting the message, we're actually adding to the array. So add message and a variable or an argument for the message itself. So very similar, so this and then underscore messages, don't forget it's an array, so square brackets. So all this means is append to what's already there. It's not replacing anything, it's not deleting anything, it is just adding to an array of messages. And we'll just set this to the passed in message. Just save that. So the next thing we need to do is the data. So exactly the same before, public function set data, and we'll pass in some data, and exactly the same, this underscore data equals the passed in data. So set the data, I'll just scroll this down so we can see what we're doing. And sorry, scroll it back up. The next thing is to cache. Okay, so public function set. Actually, we'll change that because it reads better when we just say to cache or not to cache. That is the question. Sorry, that was a bit of a lame joke. So to cache, and we'll pass in a to cache variable. Okay, and we're just setting exactly the same. So this underscore to cache equals to cache. So we've obviously changed that from set. It just reads better. Okay, right, so now that we've got that, we now need to start building this response data up, because this is what we're going to return as a response. So what we'll do, we'll build that as part of the send function. So the send will send whatever we've created here as a response back to the client. So this is what it'll be called when you're ready to return the response from our controller code, basically, after we've built the response up. So that is public function, and we'll just call it send. Oops, send. We're not passing any arguments into this because it is just using the data that's in the instance that's been built up using these set methods. Okay, so I'll just make this bigger just so we can see what we're doing. The first thing to note is we are always returning a JSON response. As mentioned in a previous video, we'll be dealing with JSON response exclusively within this course. So we need to tell the client when this response comes back what data it is or what type of data it is. So how to do that, you use a PHP function called header, and in single quotes, this is an HTTP response header of content-type. And the type is application /JSON. But what we need to do, we need to say what type of character set it is. It's always good practice to say what type of character set there is. So we will be using char set equals UTF-8. So we'll be using the UTF-8 character set. Semicolon. Okay, now that we've told the client what this type of data that we're going to return is, we then need to say whether they can cache the response or not. So it's a bit of logic here. So if, and then we need to check that our variable, to cache variable, is set to true. So if this underscore to cache equals true, just note the double equals sign there because we're not assigning it, we're actually doing a comparative. True. Then, and what we need to do, we need to also return a new header an HTTP header. So header, let's put the semicolon there just to make it easier so I don't forget. And then this one is called cache control. And if it's true, we want to store it for a maximum time of 60 seconds. So max age equals 60. This is seconds. So what this does is it tells the client that it can cache the response for a maximum of 60 seconds. So if the user was to request a certain type of data back and we allow that to be cached, if they try and retrieve that within 60 seconds of the initial request, they'll get the cached response rather than going back to the server to get the most up-to-date response. Like I say, you wouldn't want to do this for every sort of response, but it is handy to have and saves you as a developer and potentially business owner a lot of load on a server. So now that we've sent that, we need to handle if it's false. So we'll do else, and then it's obviously we need to tell the client that they can't at all cache this response. Now you'd think that you could just get away with just not setting this. However, sometimes clients have their own caching methods in there, so we need to explicitly say that this response cannot be cached. So it's another header and it's exactly the same. So it's cache dash control, and we want to say no dash, cache and no dash store. So this is the safest way to do it. So no cache, and you can't store any of the response at all on the client. It always has to come back to the server to get a response. Okay, so now that's that done. We need to move on to, we need to see if the response that we're creating is valid before we send it back, because if there's been a problem setting one of these, then we need to return like a standard response. So it doesn't get any data, it does just generate a standard 500 status code, which is a server error. So this is basically a catch-all of an error. So we'll do our checks here. So if, so the first thing we need to do is we need to check to make sure this is a true or false. So we'll do that in here. So, oops, sorry. Just overrode it there. So this underscore success. And what we'll do here, we'll do an exception. So it'll be, if it's not true or false, then we'll return the error message back to the client. Because if we said if it is true or false, you ended up with basically nested ifs, and you can have the pyramid of doom as it's called, where you just have lots and lots of logic, and then at the end when it satisfies that, you then have your code that provides a successful response. So what we do is we return just from the if statement, if there's an error or if the data is not valid, we return the response. You'll see once we start building this. So if success is not equal to false, and it's not equal to true, so this success is not equal to true. So you can say there, if the success is not false and not true, so that means it's some other value, such as 5 or 10 or test or some text or whatever, then we will generate the standard response. So PHP has a function to set the response, the HTTP response code, and that is HTTP response code. And because this is an error response, it's a server error basically, because there's something that's happened that's caused the response not to be valid. We'll say it's a 500. So the 500 code is server error, if you remember rightly. And then the next thing we need to do, actually, before we start building this, we can use this if statement to build up any other variables that need to be set for a successful response. So instead of having multiple ifs and multiple response, like standard responses, we'll just have it all included in this. So if I just go back to the top, the other thing we want to check is the status code. So if I haven't provided one, then the response is not valid, basically. We're not too bothered about messages because they're optional. Data is optional. We don't have to return any data if we don't want to. Cache has a standard value of false anyway, so that's fine. And response data, well, we're building that up as part of this send method anyway. So really the only other thing we need to check is HTTP status code. So if we just add this into this if statement, it just makes it a bit more simpler. So that is its own check. So what we need to do is encompass this in brackets because that is its own, because there's two of them. So we'll just put this in brackets. I'll just get rid of that additional bracket there and put that in bracket there. And then what we need to do is do an OR. So to do an OR, you space, and then it's two pipes. And then we need to check make sure the HTTP status code is a number. Don't forget, we're checking to make sure that it is not a number. So we're handling the exception basis on this. So if it's not is numeric, and then we'll pass in the this underscore HTTP status code. So you can see here that this statement here has to be either true or false, but we're checking to make sure that it's not false and not true, or we're doing an or here, or the status code. Oops, I've got $sign there. We'll delete that one. Or if is numeric, so if it's not numeric, because we've got the not, then we're going to supply a standard HTTP error response. So like I say, this handles the errors because we're checking to make sure that if it contains invalid data, then we do this, we carry these actions out. So getting back to the standard response, so supply a response code of 500. Next thing we need to do is start building up, and I'll just scroll up, this response data array so we can return it. How to do that is, so because it's an instance variable, so this dash greater than, and then we want to underscore response data, and because it's an array, we can give it a key. We need to return, so we need to return the status code. Now what I'm doing here, this status code here returns that to the client. It's mainly invisible to the user unless you open the dev tools in Chrome or Internet Explorer or something like that. You'll be able to see that, but generally this is hidden to the user. So just for readability, I'm also going to supply this status code in the JSON output, just so an end user can see what status code has been returned easily. You don't have to do this, but I just think it's handy for any troubleshooting or quickly just seeing what response you got back. So we're going to name this value or key that we're going to return is just status code, and we're going to set that to 500 because that's what we've set here. Now generally we wouldn't set any status codes here really, because we're going to pass them in from our controllers when we start building them. But because this is the error response, we are saying that this is a server error, so we're returning a server error response. So now that we've returned the status code, we need to return the success. I'm just going to tear that up. So exactly the same, this underscore response data, and this one is success, and we'll set this to false because we know if we're building this, it hasn't been successful, so we'll know that it's false. So the next thing we're going to do is add a message. So this, what we'll do is we'll actually add the message to here first, and then we'll assign that to the JSON response. So this add message, we'll pass in a string, response creation error. Make sure I put a semicolon at the end there. We're going to return back there's been a response creation error. So just by looking at it, if you open this response or try and request something using a browser, you should be able to see easily what the error was, basically. So now what we need to do is assign the messages to the standard response data. So this response data, and we'll call this messages because it contains multiple messages, and we'll equal this underscore messages. So we're just going to return the messages, any message, because it can be more than one. It's an array. So we're just going to return that, which should show any message. So what we could have done is add a second message just by calling the same function. For example, I'll just show you this and just say, well, this is another message, test message. So you can see here that response creation error would be returned as a message, and test message would also be returned because we're adding messages to the array. Let's get rid of that because we're not using it. Okay, I'm just going to save that. Right, so what we need to do now is the opposite of this, basically. So if it's successful, so we'll just get rid of this white space just to tidy it up a bit. Okay, so now what we need to do is the else statement. So else. So that's if there's an error with success or HTTP status code. Now we're going to do if they're satisfied, so it is a true or a false, and the status code is numeric, we're going to build a successful response. It's exactly the same as what we've done here, but instead of sort of defining codes and numbers, we're actually going to pull them in from our instance variables up here. Scroll back down. So the first thing we need to do is to set the response code exactly the same. So HTTP response code. So what we need to do is pass in, so this, and it's HTTP status code. So we'll pass in that variable because that's what we're going to return. Obviously we set these via the controller, which we'll get onto in a later video. We're just building a standard response at this time. And then we'll do exactly the same. So we need to display or send the status code in the JSON response. So this, okay, and this is, we're building the response data here. Response data, and it's an array. Status code, and instead of set it to 500 like we did before, we'll just use this same variable. So this, and then it's underscore HTTP status code, and then the next one was a success flag. So we're just doing exactly the same before, but this time we're actually creating the successful response, which will be using the values stored in the variables. So response data success, and we'll set this to this underscore success, and then any messages. So this response data messages, and we'll set this to this messages. So that's that. And because it's going to be a successful response, we're going to return the data. We're going to return any data, if there is any, in the successful response. So to do this, it's exactly the same. This underscore response data, and we'll call this just data equals this underscore data. So you can see here, from the previous demo, you'll have noticed that we wrapped the data within a wrapper. Now the wrapper contained things like these here, so a standard status code, success message, messages, and then we had the data, which then contained things like number of rows and then a list of tasks. This is actually building up the wrapper at the top here, and then within the wrapper there's a data, and the data can be tasks, users, whatever you want to be. It just means that for every response that we send back, we will always have a status code, a success flag, and potentially any messages. Messages can be empty, but that's good because you can have your client check to see if there's any messages present. And if there is, return them to the client on the app or something like that. So now that's the response data set up, we now need to return this to the browser or to the user. So in order to do that, we echo it out, and the JSON encode function will automatically convert this array to appropriate JSON. So what we need to do is just pass in the response data. So this underscore response data, and I'll just save that. Let's get rid of some of this white space just to tidy it up a bit. Okay, save that again. So in theory, we should be good to go. We've got the private variables, we've got the functions to set it, and then we'll have the function called send to then provide the response back to the browser. We can test this, because just to prove that it works really before we get into the controllers and other stuff. We'll just prove that this works by creating like a test file that will call this response, and we'll just pass in some variables just to demo it really. It is a file we're going to delete, so I'm just going to stick it in the model folder anyway because we're going to delete it. So if you right click on model, new file, and we'll call this response test.php. Like I say, we're going to get rid of this. This is just a demo of what we've built. We'll give it the PHP start tag, and we need to require, because we need to pull in this response PHP file here. So to do that, require once, because we're in the same folder, if you put it somewhere else, you will have to sort of enter the path in here, but because we're in the same folder, I can just call response.php. Basically, it's just it needs that file, which is our response class, before we can do anything else with the code. What we need to do is initialize the object or initialize the response that we're going to send back. So we'll just store it in a variable called response. So new, also have to spell it right, response. So we've got that. Right, the first thing we need to do, just quickly go back, is set some of these up just to demo it. So what we'll do is we'll go to response test file, and then we'll go response, because this is the response object, and we'll call the function set success, and we'll pass in a boolean value. So we'll just say true for this one, a good test, and then the next thing we need to do is set the status code. So response set status, sorry, I think it's called set HTTP status. Yeah, sorry, set HTTP status code. So set HTTP status code, and we'll pass in 200. That's a successful OK message. And we'll set a couple of messages in there just so you can see how it's returned. So response, it was add message, and then pass in a string value. So we'll just say test message 1, and we'll add in another message, response add message, we'll call this test message 2. Okay, now that we've built the response up, we'll return it. We're not returning any data at the moment, but we'll just make sure that we haven't got any errors in our code, and we'll get something back on the client type of thing. So now we've built it, we need to send it. Remember the send function that we created previously. So dollar response, and it's just send. Just save that. You'll have to start MAMP if it's not running. So because mine's already running, what I'll do, I'll open Postman just to show you. So in my applications folder, I have an application called Postman. It's what we used to demo the API in a previous video. And we need to type in our URL. And because we're using MAMP on our local server, the URL is http://localhost. Now by default, MAMP runs on port 8888. And then it's our folder structure from there. So if I just quickly go back to Atom, you can see that it's v1 and we're in the model and it's response test. So what we need to do is /v1/model/response test.php. So /v1, remember version 1 of our API, /model/response test.php. Make sure to get request because that's all we're doing at the minute. This is just a test, just a demo that the response returns. So we'll send that. So you can see there that this is the basis of our standard JSON response. You can see that the status code over here is at 200. That's what the HTTP status code function does. So we'll quickly go back to Atom and the response. Sorry, the HTTP response code function. That's what that returns. So because we built it up using a 200 code here, that's what we're returning. I'll just quickly go back to Postman. Success is a true because that's what we passed in. And messages, you can see that it's an array. Our first message, our second message. And at the moment our data is null because we're not returning anything. But you can see here that this is our wrapper for every response that we will return. Now the good thing about building a model for this, if we needed to change the response, you literally just change one file, the response.php file, and then we can add in new values in here and they would be consistent on every response that we get back. So it's good having everything in one file. You should always sort of produce an object like that and return that object. It just allows you to stop code duplication and things like that. So just to show you that this is actually working, we'll just adjust the test again. And we'll say false because the success wasn't false. We may have failed to delete something or create something. And we'll just change this to a 404 error. And we'll only return one message this time. And we'll just change it to something different. Error with value, for example. I'm just sort of making it up as I go here. Make sure you save it. Go back to Postman. Just send the request again. You can see there that now we've got a 404 error in the response HTTP. We show the response status code within the JSON just so it's easily seeable or easily viewable. See, we've changed the success to false, and you can see that actually we've only got one message now, error with value. Okay, now that that's working, I'm just going to go back to Atom. I'm going to close this response test and I'm going to delete it. So right click, delete, because we don't actually need that anymore. We don't want to clutter up this because you'll be wondering what each file actually does once we get to the end of it. So the only thing that we've done at the minute is generate the standard response class, which produces a standard JSON response.